This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. When it comes to discussing the filmography of the legendary George A. Romero, I believe The Crazies is his most understated and overlooked masterpiece. It tells the story of a small rural town in Pennsylvania that one night awakens to an aggressive military quarantine due to the outbreak of an experimental bioweapon in the local water supply known as Trixie, which causes those infected to become crazy and homicidal. While far from a zombie movie in the traditional sense, The Crazies has an important place within this particular genre, as it helped further define many of the long-standing human condition tropes that were previously established in Romero's first film, Night of the Living Dead. What makes it a compelling entry into a genre that, let's face it, has become exhaustingly cliched over the years, despite a few worthy gems sprinkled in between, is that it's one of the few third-person narratives in a mostly singular perspective genre. Again, I will pedantically stress, it's not technically a zombie movie, but considering it follows the structure of one pretty rigidly because, well, it's made by the guy who pioneered that very structure, I consider it part of this deviant subcategory along with stories like 28 Days Later, The Last of Us, Cell, and basically anything that swaps out Romero-style zombies for something that still follows the same formula. I said this a long time ago in a video on Night of the Living Dead, but the reason some of us call them Romero zombies and not just zombies is because Romero never strictly declared them as such. Despite many conflicting accounts of Romero's ultimate intentions, he viewed them as simply these ambiguous mutated ghouls with characteristics similar to vampires, and The Crazies was more or less a haunting reinforcement of that very ambiguity.
One of them was delirious for 2 days before he finally died. The other phased in and out until he finally went hopelessly mad. Those are the two ultimate effects of this thing. It leaves its victims either dead or incurably mad. You got that?
The core fear simply came from this idea that one day your loved ones could just turn unexpectedly violent and unreasonable, and there was nothing you could do about it, and before you know it, society has slowly collapsed and decayed all around you. While The Crazies was the only time Romero ever explained an outbreak in any of his films, it was still broadly focused on the dehumanizing effects a man-made virus had on an innocent population, where even those unaffected by the virus itself might still be provoked into impulsive behavior and violence, thus blurring the line between man and, dare I say it, monster. Yeah, I'm fully aware I'm sinking into the old cliche of man is the biggest monster, but keep in mind, back then, it was a tangible social fear, and here was a film that demonstrated random acts of violence through insiders and people who knew each other, as opposed to the deviant outsiders so common in later slasher movies. Look, I know many like myself have probably seen the Red Letter Media video on George A. Romero and his blatant use of social commentary, and yes, he could be pretty on the nose about it, but subtext is pretty common practice in horror, and if you really find it patronizing, with Romero's films, it's typically easy just to ignore it, because they're ultimately still B-movie popcorn flicks. Although I will say Rich Evans did sardonically nail the point about a lot of 70s horror being about the Vietnam War, because no surprise, it was actually the main inspiration for The Crazies, seeing as it dealt with government conspiracy, PTSD soldiers, chemical warfare, and everything that was basically going on in American politics at the time. However, before I get into the finer details, I will be covering the 2010 remake slightly later in a spoiler-heavy section of the video, because not only is it a really decent remake that actually complements the original, it's also the most easy and direct way I can explore the interesting approaches to the storytelling. The remake essentially compresses the story into something more digestible and mainstream friendly by focusing predominantly on the dramatic horrors of the virus itself, instead of the broader conflicting politics surrounding it, but like I said, I will come back to these specifics later in the video. Lastly, I want to take a moment to thank this week's sponsor ExpressVPN for making this video possible. As someone who pays for way too many streaming services, there was a point where I felt ripped off by how limited my options gradually became until I discovered the wonderful world of ExpressVPN. Geographical restrictions are a nightmare for media lovers like myself because some of the best films and shows available are only accessible in specific countries. For example, being in the UK, after watching Fear Street on Netflix, I wanted to go on a nostalgic trip by rewatching R.L. Stine's Goosebumps, but only season 1 is available on the UK Netflix server. However, for less than $7 a month, ExpressVPN allows me to select from nearly 100 countries and trick websites into thinking that's where I am, by masking my IP address and channeling my data through secure encrypted servers to protect my online privacy. By simply selecting a US location and clicking connect, I was able to access all the other seasons of Goosebumps available on the US server. Conversely, if you're in the US, horror flicks like Crawl and The Descent are unavailable, but again, by selecting a UK location and clicking connect, you have an entire additional library available to you. Without a VPN, it's like going to the gym but only being allowed to use a rustic bike with 3 settings while all the shiny new equipment is just out of reach. You're still paying the same rightful membership as everyone else, so why not get more out of the service you're legally paying for? This is why ExpressVPN receives consistent acclaim from tech critics. It gives you back your right to unrestricted access to the internet and can be used on any of your favorite streaming services, including Prime and Disney Plus, on any device of your choice. So with the addition of fast speeds, a 24-hour customer service, and a 30-day money-back guarantee, find out how you can get 3 months free by visiting expressvpn.com/Ryan. And while you're looking into it, let's dive further into the crazies. So, the 1973 version of the Crazies follows several distinct perspectives: a civilian group led by Vietnam veterans David and Clank, a scientist called Dr. Watts sent in to create a cure, unnamed government officials attempting to covertly control the situation, and a jaded military colonel called Peckham who declares martial law and forces the entire town into quarantine. In between this, we witness scenes of gruesome, senseless violence and destruction as the locals revolt against the military's deadly measures after they lose sight of who's infected and who isn't. It's a sharply abrupt and frantically moving film as the military arrive immediately after we open to a grisly, nightmarish scene of a father murdering his entire family. In these types of stories, we're typically so used to building anticipation and getting a feel for the impending doom, which is exactly what the remake does. But here, it maintains this harsh realism where everything being perpetually sudden and out of control is the key feeling it aims to convey. One random night, suddenly this small, peaceful place is plunged into chaos and you have no time to react to it. It's erratic, overwhelming, disorientating, and every character is left asking the same question: what the hell is going on?
Don't give me that shit, boy.
In fact, this distressing emotional disposition is explicitly placed on the police, doctors, and firefighters, those who we depend on for reassurance and safety during a time of crisis. They're made to feel the same confusion and helplessness as the locals being physically forced out of their homes by literal masked men at gunpoint who have authorization to shoot anyone who resists. This is the apparent dehumanization I mentioned in the beginning. It doesn't just come from the effects of the virus itself causing its victims to go insane. In fact, the virus is irrelevant, and it's deliberately left unclear how much of the overall population has been infected. Instead, the outward effects come from how the military herd the locals like animals for the slaughter, force them into confined spaces with those who might be infected, separate parents from their own terrified children, and the ensuing hostility from locals who think they're under attack.
Tell me what this is all about. Maybe I'll cooperate with you. No! What's going on? Please tell me what they're doing.
The picture it conveys is pretty blunt. The army are seen as invaders rather than protectors.
The army may just be here to help.
The man thinks the army's our friend.
I just don't know that we're doing the right thing.
Yet, it goes beyond the obvious indication that the government are the true villains of the story. There's a tremendous amount of rich complexity to the individual characters that shows how they personally suffer from the effects of the devastation.
But Christ, we never expected this! Neither did we.
While it would have been easy to make the main military leaders Major Ryder and Colonel Peckham power-hungry tyrants like you've seen in dozens of Army is Bad style narratives, the Crazies presents them as surprisingly sympathetic without absolving them of their complacency towards the increasing barbaric behaviour of their own men. They feel just as sick and demoralised about what they have to do, especially Peckham, who grows noticeably disillusioned by his own government before ultimately swallowing his moral pride in defeat as they make him responsible for suppressing the chaos.
It just amazes me at how shoddy this operation is.
Nothing amazes me anymore, Doctor. Nothing in this goddamn army amazes me.
Both of them are pressured into their position and become the sole faces of the operation, thus making them feel personally accountable for things that are somewhat outside their overall control.
What is this, another piece of information they forgot to pass on to you guys?
There's a powerful visual symbolism in how they're just following orders from their faceless superiors and passing them on to faceless soldiers who are relieved of any moral responsibility. But again, as many characters like Dr. Watts state, that doesn't absolve them of declaring the violent orders. In fact, Peckham himself even admits he's ill-equipped and inexperienced to handle it because his job is to respond to enemy opposition, not his own people. Hence, their methods of suppression are characterized by purely death and destruction.
I'm a combat man. I shouldn't even be here. Just happen to be available.
All of this is essentially the broad summary of what the Crazies is ultimately about, and from here on out I will be talking about specific characters and outcomes by contrasting them against the remake, so consider this your major spoiler warning before we go any further. So it would not surprise me if most of you have seen the remake but haven't seen the original, because the remake came out during the height of the zombie craze and benefited from a successful marketing campaign compared to the original severely undersold release in 1973. The 2010 remake pretty much covers all the main details of the original, except streamlines the story to focus solely on David and Clank's group trying to escape the town as they witness the more dramatically heightened effects of the Trixie virus. In fact, come to think of it, the remake actually reminds me considerably of 28 Weeks Later, which itself was part of a series heavily inspired by the original, as both movies pretty much follow the exact same situational beats, including the eventual nuking of the town. The most notable difference, however, is that the military are barely a presence in the remake, as not only is their perspective removed almost entirely bar a few meaningful encounters, but the danger comes predominantly from the crazed locals who are much more overtly presented as infected. The remake is basically the traditionally structured horror movie that the original aimed to avoid, but I wouldn't call that a problem, as the tighter subjective focus on David's group means that the government has this brooding eagle-eye mystique that's a bit more open to interpretation. Additionally, the mayor and sheriff's department in the original are already aware of the military's monitoring of the town prior to their unexpected intervention. It shows that both parties were diligently trying to keep the accident under wraps to avoid panic, until the government decided to get their grubby little hands involved and make everything worse. However, in the remake, everyone is left completely in the dark and there is no communication between the town and military. Instead of being firefighters, David and Russell Clank are now sheriff and deputy of the town, but it's more than a cosmetic difference. It allows them to oversee the strange happenings 2 days prior to where the original begins, including the discovery of the crash site where the Trixie virus was unleashed.
Is it going to be a big reward, Sheriff?
Travis, you ask about that again, I'm going to throw you out of the fucking boat.
Contextually speaking, David and Clank's increasingly strained relationship is pretty much the same, as David just wants to get his wife Judy out of town safely, while Clank is discovered to be slowly succumbing to the virus. Yet, I think the relationships are much better handled in the remake due to the benefit of only focusing on this core set of characters.
Russell! I saw movement! Everything is fucking moving!
Joe Anderson, who plays Clank, goes from subdued, timid deputy to menacing motherfucker with impressive subtlety, and having this balance with Timothy Oliphant's David, who I felt had a reverse transition from bold to timid as things got worse, means that the balance of power between them adds an unpredictable tension.
What the fuck is the matter with you? I said that I wanted to talk to him.
You talked.
On top of that, there's this trauma that shadows over David early in the story after he creates strain within the town for killing a gun-wielding local to the shock of everyone who begin perceiving David more fearfully. It actually ends up foreshadowing a later confrontation with the mother and son of the man he killed and who he already tried to reconcile with as they become infected and violently try to murder him and Judy, and it was only after the dust had settled did I honestly realize that's who they were. In fact, with that scene in mind, you could say that the remake is arguably more tragic than the original, or rather, it's tragic in a very different way. In the 1973 film, David's plan to escape ultimately fails as the entire group perishes while David himself gets arrested, whereas in the remake, David and Judy emerge as the sole survivors of the whole town. Those that were detained by the military are discovered to have been massacred to prevent the spread of the virus, but it does no good as the virus still spreads to another town anyway. In the original, there is a massacre of sorts, but they still retain many survivors for testing as Peckham is relocated to another town where the virus has emerged, ending with him depressively preparing for more misery and chaos. The real distinguishing tragedy that the remake doesn't include is Dr. Watts, the scientist sent in by force to develop a cure. Dr. Watts is essentially this red herring of hope who kinda speaks morally for the audience. He's outwardly scornful of the government's actions right from the very beginning, and seems to be the one positive, proactive character doing anything to save the town.
I'm one of the only chances we have. I can't get back to a lab because you're not equipped to run a medical check, which we wouldn't need in the first place if I hadn't packed off here.
However, just as he attempts to deliver the cure to Peckham, he's killed in a stampede and drops both serums, and for some idiotic reason, he didn't leave any notes on how he engineered it. Thus, those left to take over shrugged their shoulders with zero urgency, saying, we'll figure it out eventually.
Sooner or later. Sooner or later, we'll find a human. Sooner or later.
It plays into this overarching lack of communication that sparks chaos that could have been prevented if the various parties had just talked to each other. I mean, that's literally what the mayor and military were doing before the government decided to force an intervention. If they had just listened to Dr. Watts and took his guidance seriously, this probably could have been handled a lot more smoothly, and most importantly, a lot less deadly. You could say the remake has David be the red herring of hope because he becomes aware of the danger early on and tries his best to prevent things from escalating, but loses control when the military intervene. In fact, when he confronts a young soldier later on, it's revealed that the army are just as clueless and terrified as the civilians, with some even being morally disgraced at what they have been told to do, making David lose more and more hope as things only ever get worse. If there is one tonal detail that the remake gets perfectly from the original, it's the feeling of melancholy and cynical acceptance in the ending. In the original, Peckham is about to see more death and destruction as the cycle continues, while with David and Judy, they're left all alone, having lost everything and everyone they know, walking into an uncertain future that we're left suspecting isn't going to end well. Even though I've literally spoiled the entire thing, I hope I've gone some way to encouraging you to check out the Crazies for yourself, because you'll actually start to see how much of a prominent influence it had on later fiction within the genre. As a horror, it's one of the most brutal portrayals of gun violence I've ever seen in film, along with this unorthodox and casual presentation of gore that caught me off guard in the same way that the original Dawn of the Dead did. I don't believe one version is better than the other. In this case, I feel it all comes down to personal preference because they approach the story in unique and satisfying ways and capture the haunting extremities of the chaos. I do expect many to prefer the remake due to its greater narrative accessibility and being a more overtly terrifying watch, but like I said in the opening, they perfectly complement each other as a small-scale epic. So in all, watching both the remake and original together gives you this complete picture of how a quaint, tranquil town untouched by the contamination of power can so very quickly escalate into a fractured symbol of man-made destruction.